YouTube channel, Bible Realities, Lesson 5, The Blame Game. There are certain earmarks of this modern world which I call badges: dishonesty, irresponsibility, and selfishness. Each of those negative qualities is connected to what I call the blame game, the flaw which is woven throughout the fabric of modern society and that around this entire planet. Without going into great detail, I will point out that the blame game is going strong in our nation's capital and other political circles in this country, between news networks, the business sectors of society, and now manifesting within the medical field, contradictory virus views. The blame game is also rampant in the constant conflict between employers and their employees, between industry and the unions, workers and the boss. And some non-Christian groups are accusing Christian believers for the rise of the coronavirus. There is no basis for that blame claim, but those unbelievers have to blame someone for what they do not understand. Or maybe they are just being deliberately dishonest. Remember about the attitudes and actions that are related to the blame game: dishonesty, irresponsibility, and selfishness. But here I need to point out that the blame game, known by its components, dishonesty, irresponsibility, and selfishness, is not a modern phenomenon. The practice actually began in the Garden of Eden. In fact, the blame game was one of the first evidences of the fall of man. And since every one of Adam's offspring is born on this planet with Adam's fallen nature, it ought to be no surprise that all who live upon this planet exhibit Adam's fallen nature from one generation to the next by perpetuating the blame game. History proves that fact. And while not everyone is a skilled professional in that blame game profession, every person on this planet has participated in the blame game to varying degrees. As soon as we humans can point our finger or express ourselves in intelligible sounds, we have the tendency to place the blame for our own guilty actions on someone else. We can see that self-preservation tendency even in little children, and that quite often. I said the blame game started in the Garden of Eden, so let us now dwell on that Bible truth. Eve obviously believed the devil's words over God's words and ate of the forbidden fruit. Then she gave some of it to Adam, and he partook of it as well. Therefore, they both were guilty of outright disobedience to God. That entire blame game incident is recorded in Genesis chapter 3. Fear was the first response of Adam and Eve after they had incurred guilt because of their sin. And fear of the consequences motivated both of them to be dishonest with God by first hiding from Him in the bushes, and then by each trying to hide him and herself from their own personal guilt by trying to shift the blame for their personal guilt to someone else, even on God Himself, thereby refusing to take responsibility for their own sin. And it was all based upon selfishness, which is the main motivation in the blame game. Adam blurted out, "The woman you gave me the forbidden fruit, so I ate it." Thus Adam blamed the woman for his actions and indirectly blamed God Himself, for Eve was God's idea. Then Eve excused herself by saying the serpent made her do it. She refused to admit any personal guilt by claiming she had been deceived by someone else. But that did not relieve her of her guilt. She still had to pay a stiff price for her sin. And so did Adam and the serpent and Satan. Neither the blame game nor its players neutralizes God's command. Both the serpent and the devil were stuck. They had no other being to whom they could transfer their guilt. Both had to pay the price for their involvement in man's fall. And they're still paying the price. See Genesis 3:14, Isaiah 65:25, John 12:31, and Hebrews 2:14. And in every generation, all who play the blame game end up paying a price for it sometime in the present or future, or both. For God is not mocked, Galatians 6:7. Whatever a man sows, he will also reap. Each of these Bible lessons has one or more punchlines, primary words of wisdom for the viewer. In some lessons, the punchline is right up front. In some, it is toward the middle, and in some, it is at the end. In this lesson, I have at least two punchlines, front and center. The first primary point of this lesson was close to the beginning of the lesson. The blame game started in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve attempted to camouflage their own guilt by blaming someone else, even the Creator himself. And thereafter, the blame game principle became part of man's fallen nature. And that fallen nature, being passed on from one generation to another, explains why people still engage in the blame game. It will be that way until Jesus comes back to this planet and changes the rules. Of course, that does not excuse anyone for their involvement in the blame game. The second punchline of this lesson: that blame game syndrome being part of the human psyche and every human being participating in it at least to some degree, either in the past or the present, that means few people in this modern age are honest with other folks or with God about their own personal decisions and actions. So few take responsibility for their decisions and actions. And that blame game habit is based on human selfishness. Be patient as I explain. First, let me emphasize that exposing actual faults in others that hurt others is not part of the blame game. A biblical example: Paul said that when Peter had come to Antioch, he confronted Peter to his face because he was to be blamed. Galatians 2:11. Blame is number 2607 in Strong's Concordance. Now, Paul was not trying to transfer guilt from himself to Peter, but was exposing Peter's guilt. Peter was engaging in the worst kind of hypocrisy, and Paul publicly confronted him about it. That is a key in discerning the difference between that blame game practice and setting things aright among brethren. Guilty parties need to be dealt with, and that often even in public. Another Bible example is the deacon Stephen blasting the hypocritical actions of the Jewish leaders who were trying him illegally by using false witnesses against him in an attempt to silence the gospel message. They did manage to kill that faithful man of God, but they did not succeed at silencing the gospel. The blame game is totally different. Most of the time, the people who blame others for unsavory acts are themselves guilty of the same acts. They are trying to transfer their guilt from themselves to some other person or group, hoping to spare themselves from being held accountable for their wrong actions, and therefore avoiding any unpleasant consequences for their actions, be they immoral, unethical, or illegal actions. Thus, the blame game is first of all dishonest, and thus it is irresponsible and selfish. Irresponsibility means that one wants to do some bad thing without having to bear the consequences of their bad act, even what has harmed others. And that means such actions are based upon outright selfishness. Let somebody else pay the price for my acts that serve only myself, regardless of what it may cost some other individual or group. However, the blame game itself has a hefty price tag for those who play it. We will discuss that Bible reality later. Again, this is lesson number 5 of The Way It Really Is.